This episode of Shootin' The Shiznit is brought to you by 80stees.com, the leading online retailer of licensed t-shirts. They specialize in retro movie, music, TV shows, video games, comic books, wrestling, and cartoon t-shirts. So how can you help us and also buy cool t-shirts? Well, we want you to go to tinyurl.com/STS80stees. That's right. That's tinyurl.com/STS80stees. Go there, buy some t-shirts. We get a kickback. They don't cost you no different. Now to the show. Have you listened to episode 20? It's my old buddy Dave Prazak talking about Shimmer. That's right. Here's a clip, download, and listen.
Everybody was like, how come you don't have a champion? Like, because we just started. We need to run some shows, get people used to who all the wrestlers are first, then we'll crown a champion. And so we were running shows for like a year, and then like, all right, we'll do a tournament. And then like, Sarah Del Rey's winning it, and then she's going to hold the belt for 7 years. Because I'm like, she's already main eventing all the shows. We don't need to have anybody. It's like the Sarah Del Rey versus the world. That is what Shimmer is. But well, you know, once we got into the thick of things, we decided, all right, it would get really stale if it was just Sarah all the time wrestling everybody. So, you know, we changed it up, but you know, it should mean something. Not everybody should have the chance to be the champion. It should be only the elite few. So we've limited it as much as we can, and if it's only 12 champions, then it's 12 champions. So.
I mean, I agree with you. I like that part about it. Always, I feel if you say then I won the Shimmer title. If you look at the list of women that's won it, it's it is the elite. So you got Mischief that has
and
it for the longest there.
It's less than 12 human beings that have held it. There's a couple of them.
Oh yeah. You're right. Yeah.
So it's even less than 12. It's like 9. So.
Right. All right. You said you didn't watch NXT, but then you had the 3 girls that were NXT doing the match the other night. Was all former Shimmer girls.
Yes, and originally.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Let's start the party.
This is a special edition on Thursday. Special edition is going to be me setting down part 2. Steve Beverly will be the guest that got the most time ever. That's right. This is episode 71, and we're in STS Studios in St. Louis, Missouri. A big shout out to Bob McGee at Pro Wrestlers Between the Sheets. That's www.pwbts.com. Wrestling to Max website. Gene Jackson at Locals to Legends. We do appreciate all the plugs and the helps with those episodes. We do, really do. I really do. Guys, y'all can follow me at Comic Book Mark BT. That's on Twitter. At BT Shootin' The Shiznit on Instagram. If you want to send some money, and some of you guys do, to support the podcast, what I want you to do is send it to Brian_Tramel at Yahoo.com. That's on PayPal. We also got tons of stuff. We got hoodies, t-shirts, stickers. tinyurl.com/STSPod merch. If you want to listen to all the episodes, we're on www.stspod.club. Or you can go to iTunes, Stitcher, Play FM, Player FM, Pod Paradise, Spreaker, AM Radio, FM 103. And also remember, we have a Shootin' The Shiznit Facebook page. And we also have a Cool Kids Wrestling and MMA Talk Facebook group. You got to ask to join that. And if you're an ass, we'll kick you out. That's just the rules. Hey guys, let's get to the show. Back from the green room to sit down once again
on Shootin The Shiznit and talk about Matt Watts wrestling and everything during that time. If you haven't listened to part 1, go back and listen to part 1. Because we're just going to kind of jump right into what we were talking about. So it might be kind of important to listen to part 1 and also give me some download numbers. But I was looking, Steve, through, like I told you, I grabbed up the, I don't know if you know this, and I didn't know until I started back into podcasting, that there is, there's tons of sites out there, but there's a few of the sites that put up all these old newsletters. Someone had downloaded 5 of Wrestling Riot and wanted me on their podcast because they said it was, and I was like, where did you find this at? But there's a couple of wrestling sites out there, and I actually went to look for Matt Watch, and all they had up was the annuals, and read through them real quick yesterday and this morning. The annual, the yearbook, which, that was Dave's gimmick with the yearbook, was something that I wish they still did, but I understand there's so much time. But it was always fun to see. And your awards weren't always the same as, that's what was really funny, is your awards sometimes were not near what Dave or our Pro Wrestling Torch readers. So it gave me an indication there's much more than just everyone that reads Observer doesn't read Matt Watch and vice versa kind of thing. But looking through them, I mean, we talked about this on episode 1, and I'm just going to throw the question out to you. And you kind of answered it, but you had an article in there. And why, I believe, the article's name was, Why Did the 80s Change Wrestling?
Mm-hmm.
And to this day, I don't know if there was, and people talk about Monday Night Wars, up until we had the network, the WWE network, which totally changed what we're doing now. Whether people think bad, good, I love because I have access to everything. But why did the 80s? Why let the young whippersnappers know why the 80s changed professional wrestling and still make it, what we're doing today has to do with what happened then.
You have to look back also at what happened in the 1950s to understand why the 80s was such a sea change in professional wrestling. And it all had to do with television. Back in the late 40s and early 50s, and if you go back and look at some of the very earliest network schedules, and the part of the reason that this happened is because they were still in a radio economy. A lot of people still didn't have television sets yet, and some people didn't actually get their first TV sets until the late 50s or even early 60s. But what happened is that they didn't have big budgets for production for shows that we would today look at with the kind of special effects that dramatic shows have and the kind of salaries that actors make. Those dollars weren't there then. And so they had to look for inexpensive programming, but they also wanted to look at programming that could help sell television sets. And wrestling and boxing were both very intimate sports because they got right down into the action. It was a one-on-one, or in wrestling if you had tag team matches, but the cameras got right down on the action. And so it was a very good type of programming for early television to help sell television sets. I remember my parents telling me that the first television they ever saw was in 1952 in Fernandina Beach, Florida. They were at a restaurant, and they looked up and what was on the screen but wrestling. And so it was because of that at one point in time, the television networks, up until about 1952, you saw pro wrestling in prime time anywhere from 3 to 7 nights a week. And eventually that all went by the boards as more money came into television and it became more sophisticated, and wrestling then became a local and regional television event that made a lot of money for a lot of local TV stations, and it helped many promoters be able to fill their arenas or at least have good arena attendance up until we had the 80s. And what changed everything was when cable television came along, And suddenly it was not just an industry that reproduced local signals. Then when you suddenly had your ESPNs, your USA networks, when you had the superstations like TBS and WGN and WWOR in New York, when those began to proliferate, then suddenly they had, even though they were fractionalized as far as their audiences were concerned, they were becoming a player. And if you consider that even if Vince McMahon had not succeeded in being the guy, and there were attempts even in the 70s to try to see if they could turn local and regional professional wrestling into a national sport. Most people that were really hardcore fans may remember in the mid-1970s when Eddie Einhorn, who was a very successful sports television executive with TVS Sports that did college basketball for many, many years, dating back to the 60s, and Eddie Einhorn, who eventually became a co-owner of the Chicago White Sox, he's tried to do what was called the IWA, International Wrestling Alliance.
Right.
And it lasted less than a year, but it was syndicated, and it was high gloss production. But the bottom line to it is he was undercapitalized, and there just wasn't yet the advertising market from national advertisers to make that successful. And so if Vince McMahon had not been successful doing what he did, somebody else would have eventually. But it changed the face of everything because suddenly you had these cable networks that, just like television did in the 50s, they were looking for what was really comparatively inexpensive programming, but had the ability to draw an audience to call attention to their programming. And that's what happened when TBS became a superstation, and all of a sudden, guys like Mr. Wrestling number 2 and many of the other stars that were part of the original Georgia Championship Wrestling that later became World Championship Wrestling, those became national stars. They were getting in demand to go wrestle at different places around the country because they were being seen on the superstation. And because of that, you had national advertising dollars at stake. And then when Vince McMahon decided to go initially into the cartoon stage of it, in a comic book style of character, and he, let's just face it, he risked his own money and could have gone under. Probably if the 1987 WrestleMania had not been successful, he might have gone under. But in short, it changed the face of everything because it was television. Cable television made all the difference in the world when you didn't just have your local channels on there, but you had these niche networks that were trying to attract audiences in the superstations. And so it was a whole new market for everything, and it frankly was the thing that fizzled out the local promotion. Now, do I think that wrestling was altogether better? I don't personally, but that's because my frame of reference was having a card at my local arena every week and following the weekly soap opera of professional wrestling. But having said that, there is no way you would have been able to stop this because it was technology and the delivery system that we were switching to that changed everything. And, of course, now, as you mentioned, Brian, the WWE Network, which was something that I halfway foresaw back around 1990, that there would be probably someday some kind of channel called the Wrestling Network or something of that, and then finally it came together, and because of all of that huge library of product that they had from swallowing up so many promotions, the WWE Network now serves an audience and a lot of people who have never seen all the classic matches that they carry.
Right, and you mentioned something. You said it gave everyone a new audience. Everyone was seen by a lot more people, and that's what's happened with the network. The network also spawned nothing to do because they could do it. Everyone else, the indie promotions, there's gazillion. I want to say probably 10 or more that are really major that the New Japan World, all these other ones that are actually using that technology to bring wrestling to many and being able to show a different audience, YouTube, you name it, and they're able to. I want to see Ricochet, who's on YouTube, and be able to bring them to local arenas and make money with them there. And technology and wrestling hand in hand in that part, like you said, the 80s. And now with that change, I remember the network had just happened. I was at a comic book convention in maybe Nashville. I was at a comic book convention, just a small one. Shane Douglas was there, and we had a conversation that I wish I could get Shane on here and talk about it, but it was about the technology of the WWE Network and how at that moment, 20 years from now, will be another one of those moments like the 80s, that cable television and the change of the network. So, and I still believe, I mean, it's every day there's something different coming out. And as a wrestling fan, if you're still a wrestling fan, it's real exciting. It was exciting in the 80s to be able to watch so much, and we got into tape trading, part of another technology with the VHS and we've talked about that here, that wrestling and technology are hand in hand in the sense that for the fans, and it's really, and the ratings and all that still probably mean more now than they did back then because of the money that they actually get from the networks and everything. Okay, so before we go, I want to talk about people that you that was involved in wrestling at the time you were doing Matt Watch, and we want to talk a little bit about the hotline there before we actually complete part 2 here. And me going through the annals and everything, but there's some names I want you to talk about, and there's really a few questions I'm going to ask you to shoot on. Not shoot bad, but I really want to know. Don't kayfabe me on this, because you're from old school, and I understand. But no, I was looking at the annual, and I want you to, Man of the Year was what you did, and every annual, and Eddie Gilbert. Now, Eddie, we've had a whole episode about Eddie Gilbert, and the words that you said about Gilbert during that year was exactly why everyone became a fan. I was a huge fan of Gilbert anyway because of Memphis, Tennessee, and me growing up. But and did you have any, did you talk to Eddie on a regular basis, personal relationship? But what made you the Eddie Gilbert fan, and what made him the Man of the Year kind of thing?
Well, I knew Eddie because he, particularly when I moved to Jackson, Tennessee, he was from Lexington, Tennessee, which is only about 30 miles up the road.
Right.
And I rode with him a couple of times down to Memphis to when he actually was doing the WMC show in the early 90s. And yeah, I knew him from that, and I knew his family. His mother was very heavily involved in local politics in that portion of West Tennessee, and so at least there was I guess you would probably say it was more of an acquaintance more than a full friendship, although I did consider him a friend. But what I really enjoyed about Eddie is that, and I think this was one of the almost tragic things about him, and when his life came to an early end, I think that one of the real things about him, he was a catalyst. Eddie was an outstanding interview, and he could do an emotional type of interview, whether he was a fan favorite or whether he was a villain. But he had an ability to, I thought that the time that he was in the Continental Association down in Alabama, they had some of the best product that they ever had, because it was built more on character relationships, and he understood that. Eddie probably understood the idea of soap opera as much as anyone did in the profession. And he was a guy who could, let's just put it this way, if you go back again, I'll give you a class example of that match when Ricky Steamboat was brought in to have it was really the tag team match on World Championship Wrestling that was designed to get him over as a major contender for Ric Flair. And so it was Ricky and Eddie Gilbert against Barry Windham and Ric Flair. And Eddie was a master of selling, and he sold. Oh yeah, very much so. He sold like crazy in that match, and then made the hot tag to Ricky Steamboat. And of course, then people who remember that match well know that Ricky scored the pinfall, and that started the month-long build-up to the Flair Steamboat match in Chicago. But Eddie had an ability to get storylines and to get matches over in a fashion. And some people have felt, and I agree with that, in that tag team match to get Steamboat over. If Eddie had not done what he did, and he did, I don't think he ever got enough credit for it. If Eddie did not do what he did, that match would have never gotten over at the same level that it would have if you'd had just maybe an average worker in the ring. I think one of the frustrations that he had was that he never could, and some of it was because of his size, he never could get himself into what one would call major stardom on a national basis. And so, but yeah, he was a friend, and he was somebody that I had many interesting conversations with him, and some that I began to understand a little bit of some of the dichotomy of this guy. He had at times a real troubled personality.
Right. We spent some time talking with Bob Barnett about Eddie, who did I call Bob Barnett the father of shoot interviews. He had done an interview with Eddie there. All right, we're going to take our commercial break, and we're going to be back with Steve Beverly.
Hey, I hope everyone's enjoying our second part of our Steve Beverly conversation. I just want to do a real quick programming note right here in between instead of a regular commercial. We will have no new episodes next week. I will be tweeting off a bunch of old episodes, though. We'll return on the 28th with Shootin The Shiznit. There on the 30th, we're going to have a Cool Kids Countdown. And in December will be the 5th with the Shootin The Shiznit. And on the 7th is a special episode, special weekend. We're going to kind of leave that as a surprise. And then the 12th, we have another Shootin The Shiznit. And on the 14th of December is Who Wants to Be the Best Shiznitter Ever Championship. And we will have no new episodes the last 2 weeks of the year. Before we get back with Steve Beverly, I want to thank Suplex City Limits, Creative Control, Who's Right Podcast, a non-wrestling podcast, and my old buddy Tom Robinson. Him and Nate, I apologize. I actually said the name of the podcast wrong. It is Wide Men Can't Jump. It's an NBA podcast. They also have Wrestling Stutter, and Tommy Rich makes an appearance every once in a while. Y'all check that out. Tom would appreciate it, and I would too. Now, back to the episode.
All right, we're here in our part 2 of our Steve Beverly conversation. Steve, we just got through talking about Eddie, and I can't, Eddie Gilbert, I can't really, I can't say enough good things about Eddie. I was not a friend of Eddie's and only met him a couple of times, which was weird because as much time as he was in Memphis dressing rooms, we just didn't. There's a lot of those guys I just didn't get to talk to, but a huge fan of his. Now, doing the newsletter, you're going to get guys that just don't like you because you're doing the newsletter. And you did a lot. There was a lot of comedy, and not really favorable on this guy. So did we ever get a call or a message or did he ever send you mail? Did Dusty Rhodes ever want to strangle your neck, Steve Beverly? So I just want to know that.
He probably did, but you know what? I never heard from him.
Oh wow!
And I will tell you, I only met the guy 2 times in my life. Once when it was back in 1977 when he and Dick Slater had won the NWA World Tag Team Championship. They let it come down from the Carolinas to Georgia for about 3 weeks. And so he and Slater came into Columbus, Georgia. And so Dusty was really at a point where he was beginning to get that national exposure that was not just in Georgia and Florida. And so Ray Bewley, who was our sports director at WTVM, and I went into Fred Ward set it up, the promoter, and we went in to interview him. And you know, Dusty was Dusty, although one of the things I thought was pretty interesting, he's tag team partners with Dick Slater, and he says sometimes you don't know what to do about Dick Slater. Dick Slater likes to argue with the promotion. Dick Slater thinks he runs everything around here. You know, and so it was a little different image than what we thought we were going to get from Dusty, because it was obvious that he wasn't real happy with Dick Slater on a personal basis.
And the history of that even makes it funnier about what he said about Dick Slater running the promotion and all that, so that even makes it funnier. But
I met him. I went to the Turner office at one point in time when Bill Watts was running the company, and so they were basically introducing me around because I was on the hotline at that time, but also because there was some consideration to bring me in as somewhat of a communications consultant to work with some of the younger guys on how to project to the camera, because you had some younger guys who just didn't know how to do an interview. Now, I'm not an expert in wrestling interviews, but I am one who I've been a speech coach for years, and I've taught that. So they were talking seriously about doing that, and it wasn't too much longer that Bill wound up out of the company, so they didn't go forward with that. But I met Dusty that day. I was taken around to meet some of the different people, and he was very cordial. I'm not even sure he knew who I was. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But, I only had 2 contacts with him, but I never heard from him personally, no.
Who was the cartoonist? I can't remember his name that did the Dusty cartoons and the annuals and Bill Kunkel, was that right?
That was it, uh-huh.
Yeah, I try to remember his name today, and I even went through, right before we got on, I was going through trying to figure out if I could find his name, but yeah, I remember it. We were, oh God, as a smart community, as small as we were, man, we were vocal about Dusty, and just, that was one of the ways, like, I've told this before, but I actually felt like I knew the wrestling business was a work, but I didn't know how it was worked. And me being, Blawa, Arkansas was a place I went, and I was 5 feet from the ring, so I could tell it was a work. But I still was a mark still am a mark, but up until, 84, 85, and I was bitching about something about how Ric Flair was beating up Dusty. To one of my friends, and it was Dick Bourne. I know you know who Dick Bourne is.
Dick Bourne.
So Dick sends me, I don't know, 6 or 7 different newsletters, the Observer and everything, and I'm just like in awe sitting there reading that and thinking, man, no one likes Dusty. So I become, the big Ric Flair fan, since, no one liked Dusty because the smart community didn't. But I remember those just not being nice, and I was thinking after looking over that, I was like, man, Dusty, either he didn't see this or he just didn't really care, when it came to that.
Well, one thing that you have to look at, Brian, is that, and probably in retrospective, maybe a lot of us were a little bit hard on Dusty in general. And, one of the things that Jim Ross told me, when Dusty came back and they brought him back to WCW as a booker in the early 90s, and they got hammered for bringing him back in, and Jim Ross was telling me, he said this guy is still, and I think the first pay-per-view that they had that Dusty was the color commentator with him, I think was in Florida, and he got a big hand there because Dusty was still a big star in Florida, because that's where he made his name. And it was and Jim was saying, he said, I know a lot of these people can't stand us for this, but he said, you got to remember, he said, we're doing this first pay-per-view in Florida, and he is a huge name here, and that makes a big difference. But I think one of the problems is that I think, look, this is like happens a lot of times in professional sports. I grew up in an era where it was sad when we saw Johnny Unitas put on a San Diego Chargers uniform.
Oh yeah, very much. Yeah.
When Mickey Mantle was in his final year in the major leagues and he hit 236, and they basically gave him a token spot in the All-Star game. He came up and took 3 feeble swings and struck out. And it was, you kept saying, I would like to remember him as he was, not how he ended. And I think the problem with Dusty was that he kept trying to do the same things, maybe with different people, but the Ric Flair Dusty Rhodes confrontations just went on too long to be effective. And sometimes the people who book organizations or and as I say, it happens in other forms of life. You sometimes, if you are so involved in it yourself, you don't recognize when it has lost its effectiveness. And
exactly.
Probably it would have been much better for him if he had retired from the actual performance of the business and concentrated on being, because it was one of those things, it's like my grandmother said, when he puts his mind to it, when he put his mind to things, he could do creative angles, but it just grew stale, and the television product grew stale under him, and it needed a fresh set of eyes. And so the bottom line to it is, I think it was as much frustration that a lot of us had with him as anything else.
Yeah, and I think he kind of redeemed himself too, especially to the wrestling fans, when he went to work for NXT, and Triple H gave him the opportunity to help create people and not, I know I didn't hear a bad word about Dusty Rhodes when he was working NXT, and which was the total opposite of him, but he wasn't involved. And all right, so we got just a few minutes left. So what I want to do is I want to talk about the WCW hotline. First of all, we had questions from Randy Smith. He's been part of our little fandom friends forever. And Randy wanted to know, just how much money was Steve Beverly making for that WCW hotline?
I'll tell you exactly, $200 a week. And it didn't matter whether the numbers were up or down. That's what it was. So I got a check for $800 a month. And it probably cost me money at income tax time because they did not take withholdings out. So
oh my God,
it actually cost me money to do that. And some people really didn't think I should have done that, and maybe they were right. I was approached by Lance Russell in 1990 about doing it, and his job was to oversee that hotline. And to try to tell you a longer story in a very short period of time, I told him, I said, Lance, the one thing, I said, I'd be interested in doing it, but I'm not going to be a shill. I'm not going to go on there and do stuff that's just going to promote WCW matches. I said, because he said, we want you to do literally a phone version of Matwatch. I said, if that's what you want, then I said, that's what I'm going to deliver. But I said, the first time that I start hearing from somebody who starts complaining because I'm not following the company line on things, I said, if I see something I don't like that happens on WCW, I'm going to say it. And I said, and if I think it's pertinent, I am going to say it. And so Lance says that's exactly what we want. So that's what I did. I was well aware that it upset some people in the company, some of the things that I said, but that's what our agreement was. And I said, I don't have to do this. So in short, it ultimately became, behind Jim Ross, it became a distant second, but it became the number 2 most listened to on the hotline, because one of the primary reasons is that a lot of the wrestlers, particularly the ones with the big names, wouldn't update their lines for 3 and 4 weeks at a time. People would call on Wednesday or Thursday, and it would be the same thing they had the previous week. So it was, it was an interesting thing. It did give me a little supplementary income with that, but it was certainly not anything that I got rich with.
Right. And did you get any heat from that? Did you ever have somebody that just didn't? And we want to hear names now too, Steve. Don't be kayfabe.
Well, I tell you,
that just really was pissed off about what you said.
Well, one that I was told was that, of course, this was more from the annuals I did. I was told that Missy Hyatt didn't like me worth 10 cents because of some things I would write, because I didn't always say that she was the greatest star in the business. But the other one, though, I got a pretty nasty call one day from Tom Zenk. Because of the fact that there had, he was suspended for at least a temporary period of time after some testing had been done. And it was, and there was also some discontent. I can tell you at one point in time when I was very, very well aware that one of the guys was going to be sent home, and I as much as said it on the hotline, and he was. And it was, but that it was. Here's the thing: Lance, I'm going to tell you one of the greatest things about Lance Russell is he was loyal. Lance Russell stood up for me against a lot of heat from people who didn't want me there because I wasn't, quote, in the business. And Lance, every time somebody would say that, Lance would go to them with dollars and cents figures, and he said, "Look what he's bringing in here." And he said, you may not like what he's saying, you may not like his opinions, but it's getting us dollars and cents. And some people had to back down off of that when that occurred. The one, I will tell you this, when they brought in Kip Fry, and Kip Fry didn't understand the wrestling business, and that's why he only lasted about 9 weeks in the job.
Right.
Kip Fry wanted me off the hotline, and Lance called me up one day, and he said, Kip wants you off the hotline because it's upsetting some people. And I knew who he was talking about. And I said, well, Lance, all I ask is just, if they want me off, they want me off. Well, as it turns out, then 3 days later, Kip Fry was out, and Bill Watts came in, and and looked at the numbers, and he said, let's keep this guy on here. He's making us money. But they did try to get me off of there, but it was during that very short-lived era of Kip Fry.
And do you think that with the WCW hotline and what you were doing, kind of ahead of its time there, in the sense that you weren't going to kayfabe? Were you kayfabing at all, or were you just? No. I know you said that you would say what you wanted to, but it was just like Matt watched, so there was no kayfabe there.
No, I would not. I said, I'm not doing this. I said, I'm not going to shill for you. I'm not going to make up things that and somebody else who had real discontent over it was Sharon Sadello, who became Mrs. Ole Anderson, when she was a Turner employee that was basically placed over the hotline at the point in time that Lance left the company.
Right.
And so she wanted me to shill. And she would call me, for about 3 or 4 weeks, she would call me every week wanting to know why I was doing this and why I was doing that. And I finally got off of it at that point. And that is also the transition point where Jim Hurd and Lance developed the alternative hotline that was known as the Wrestling Observer Hotline. And so we went to that. I probably would have been fired at that point because I knew where the complaints were coming from. And so, which was fine. And it's their company. They could do what they wanted to. But, so it gave me an opportunity for a good transition out. But, I would get a call every Monday or Tuesday from Sharon Sadello for about 3 or 4 weeks, complaining about what I had said on the hotline. And I said, look, Sharon, I didn't come on here 4 years ago or 2 years ago. I said, I didn't come on here 2 years ago to be a shill for the company. If that's what you want, you got plenty of people employed. You can do that. You can find somebody else to do it. But don't expect me to be somebody who's going to go on there and be like they're in the wrestling business. That's not me. And so when they came to me and said that we're trying to put together this alternative hotline, then I exited stage right, and then re-entered stage left. And
there you go.
but that's
hey, Steve.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, that's
go
the
ahead.
story, though.
All right. I just want to thank you for coming on. You actually gave us 2 episodes. Fun time. And one of these days we're just going to come on and talk about game shows. How's that? A wrestling podcast about game shows. And I want to thank Steve for joining us. I want to thank everyone that's been listening to this 2-part episode. Remember, guys, we're the best little wrestling podcast in the business. Same bat time, same bat channel. Be there. Thanks, man. That was fun.
Oh, me too. When you said be there, it reminded me of Freddy Miller on
That's it.
on Georgia Championship Wrestling.
That's where I stole it from.
Don't miss it. Be there.
Yeah. You had to get
Some people didn't know that Freddie went all the way back in Atlanta television to 1949, and he was one of the pioneers in Atlanta television, and did a show called Stars of Tomorrow that went on for something like 18 years, and it was a local amateur hour. And
right.
it was, I guess it was more, I wouldn't call it American Idol, but it was more like Ted Mack in the original amateur hour on a local basis. And he was, for people in Atlanta, he was known for Stars of Tomorrow as much as anything. And then all of a sudden he turns up there as the announcer on Georgia Championship Wrestling. And, he built a little following for that when he would do those cut-ins for all of the matches around the state. So
I loved him. I loved because you were sitting there listening to him. I loved his voice. I liked the whole little, I don't know what I call a TV or radio voice. My wife says she cracks up with, if she can hear me sometimes doing this podcast, I'll go into my radio voice instead of my regular voice, and I said just when I'm doing promos or getting excited. So that's the thing that I like to do. And we got so I call it the best little wrestling podcast in the business one time on one of the early shows, and I don't know if you remember. You remember Jamie Ward? You probably do.
Remember Jamie,
Jamie was like, he messaged me on Facebook, and he said, man, that should be your tagline. So, I had to put the business and, the Dusty Rhodes at the end there. And